In the twilight of Sjölycka, Siddharth carefully prepares a sanctuary of warmth as the first frost of the season arrives. He is joined by Chioma, Hassan, and Gwan-ho, who find their daily stresses fading into a deep, rhythmic silence. Together, they drift toward a state of collective peace where the boundary between wakefulness and sleep begins to blur. Listen to experience a journey of slow living and shared tranquility. Likes the scent of cedar. Siddharth Varma's palm pressed flat against the linen, sliding from the center of the table toward the edge in one long, fluid motion. He smoothed a stubborn crease near the hem, his touch rhythmic and deliberate, as if the fabric were a living thing that needed to be calmed. Outside the windowpane, the twilight of Sjölycka had turned a bruised purple, and the first true chill of the season hit the glass with a sharp, sudden pressure. The cold didn't just arrive, it claimed the periphery of the room, pushing the warmth toward the center of the hearth. Siddharth didn't pull away from the window. Instead, he tilted his head, listening to the wind as it began to comb through the distant pines, a low, mourning sound that signaled the frost was arriving hours ahead of the village forecast. He turned to the cedar and lavender candles, their wicks standing like small blackened sentinels in heavy ceramic holders. With a single match, he brought them to life. The flame didn't flicker. It held a steady, golden core. As the wax began to pool, the scent released, not as a faint drift, but as a thick, grounding anchor. The cedar provided a base of damp earth and ancient bark, while the lavender cut through with a clean, medicinal sweetness. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The room ceased to be a mere living space and became a ritual site, a sanctuary where the laws of the outside world, the wind, the ticking clock, the biting cold, were suspended in favor of a curated peace. Siddharth closed his eyes and began a low, preparatory hum. It was a sound felt more than heard, a resonance that started in the diaphragm and vibrated through the chest, intended to stir the stagnant air and weave a layer of warmth into the very molecules of the room. He focused on the luminescence, attempting to pull the golden hue of the candlelight and stretch it across the ceiling like a canopy. But as the vibration peaked, the world tilted. A sudden, sharp dizziness surged through him, a wave of vertigo that made the mahogany table seem to drift away. He gasped, his hand slapping against the dark wood to steady himself, the impact echoing in the quiet room. He stayed there for a moment, leaning heavily on the table, his forehead nearly touching the cool surface. His hands were trembling, small, erratic shivers that he couldn't suppress by sheer will. The effort of fighting the plummeting temperature, of pushing his own energy outward to shield a room that was still empty, had drained his immediate stamina. He felt hollowed out, a candle burned down to the last fraction of its wick. He knew this feeling. It was the familiar price of his own devotion. In his pursuit of a frictionless sanctuary for others, he had forgotten to ensure his own foundations were secure. He had skipped the midday meal, his mind too occupied with the precise placement of the tea service to remember the basic necessity of sustenance. Forcing himself upright, Siddharth moved to the seating area. He knelt by the heavy velvet cushions, adjusting them by fractions of an inch. He ensured that the angle of the chairs faced the fire perfectly, leaving no gap where a guest might feel the ghost of a draft. He smoothed the wool throws, his fingers lingering on the coarse texture of the knit. As he worked, he noticed his own breath beginning to mist in the cooling air. The fire was roaring, yet the frost was aggressive, seeping through the stone walls of the cottage. He was a thin line of defense between the winter and the people he hoped to protect. He drifted toward the kitchen, where the herbal infusion sat on the stove. The water was barely simmering, sending up tiny, sporadic bubbles that broke the surface with a rhythmic, slow pop. The scent of dried chamomile and peppermint rose in a thin ribbon of steam. It was a slow process, a deliberate brew that refused to be rushed, which now clashed violently with the ticking clock of the approaching freeze. Siddharth watched the water, his reflection appearing in the darkened window-pane beside the stove. He stopped. In the dim light, the hollows under his eyes looked like bruises, deep and shadowed. He looked fragile, a man who had become a ghost in his own home, consumed by the architecture of comfort he built for everyone but himself. He reached for the final candle, a thick pillar of beeswax intended for the entryway, when the silence of the house was shattered. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the porch, the unmistakable sound of a leather boot striking wood with purpose. It wasn't the tentative step of a weary traveler or the light tread of a neighbor. This was an arrival of weight and timing. Someone had come, and they had arrived far earlier than the invitation had specified. Siddharth froze, the beeswax candle still in his grip. He felt the sudden intrusion of the outside world as a physical shock. He studied the simmering pot, the half-smoothed cushions, and the trembling of his own hands. The sanctuary was not yet perfect. The friction he spent his life erasing had arrived on his doorstep in the form of a stranger's boot, and the door was the only thing remaining between his fragile, curated peace and the biting wind of the Sjölycka night. He moved toward the door, his gait slow and rhythmic despite the exhaustion. He paused at the threshold, tilting his head to listen. The wind had risen to a howl, rattling the window panes in their frames. He took a deep breath, smelling the static crackle of the coming snow and the lingering cedar of the room behind him. He smoothed the front of his tunic, a reflexive gesture to erase any sign of the dizziness that had nearly felled him. He could not let the guest see the cracks in the sanctuary. To the world, the sanctuary must be effortless. The cost of that effort was a secret he carried alone. As he reached for the iron latch, he felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature, as if the house itself were exhaling. He gripped the handle, the metal biting cold against his skin. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there for 3 seconds, closing his eyes, centering his breath, and summoning the melodic hum once more to steady his nerves. He wanted to be the embodiment of the warmth he provided, a human hearth for whoever stood on the other side. He pulled the door open. The rush of air was instantaneous, a violent torrent of frost and pine scent that threatened to blow out the candles in the hall. Standing there, framed by the swirling white of the first snowfall, was a figure clad in heavy dark wool, their presence filling the doorway and blocking out the moonlight. The visitor didn't speak at first, merely stood there, a silhouette of order and precision against the chaos of the storm. Siddharth felt the cold seep into his bones, but he kept his voice low and melodic, the sibilance of his words acting as a soft buffer against the wind. "You are early," he murmured, though he didn't move to close the door or invite them in just yet. He simply watched the way the frost began to crystallize on the visitor's collar, a slow, white bloom of winter. The sanctuary had been breached before the final candle was lit, and as Siddharth looked at the guest, he realized that the piece he had spent the evening crafting was about to be tested by a presence that did not believe in the beauty of the slow, unfolding moment. The golden hum. The low, vibrating frequency started in the base of Siddharth Varma's throat, a sound more felt than heard. He knelt on the wide oak floorboards, his fingers pressed deep into the thick, cream-colored wool of a blanket. This was not merely fabric, it was a vessel. The wool, heavy and smelling of lanolin and mountain rain, resisted him at first, its fibers dense and stubborn. Siddharth closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly to find the exact resonance of the room. He pushed the hum lower, shifting the pitch until the air around his fingertips began to shimmer. Slowly, the luminescence took hold. A soft, golden amber glow began to bleed into the wool, not sitting on the surface like a lamp, but soaking into the weave. The light pulsed in time with his breath, a slow, rhythmic throb that locked a deep, radiating heat into the very core of the fibers. To touch the blanket now was to touch a sun-warmed stone in the middle of January. He moved his hands in slow, sweeping arcs, ensuring the glow was distributed evenly from the tassels to the center. The process required a total surrender of focus. He had to become a conduit, stripping away the noise of his own fatigue to let the energy flow. His palms grew warm, then hot, the wool beneath them humming back in a sympathetic vibration. The sanctuary was beginning to breathe. The golden light cast long, dancing shadows against the cedar walls, turning the room into a gilded cocoon where the outside world, the biting wind of Sjölycka and the oppressive cold ceased to exist. He felt the edges of his own consciousness blur, merging with the amber pulse of the blanket, creating a frictionless space of absolute warmth. "Oh, they've turned out just lovely, haven't they? Like little clouds of butter." The voice arrived like a sudden splash of cold water. Dahlia Moreno entered the room, her sing-song cadence slicing through the meditative silence. She carried a heavy stoneware tray laden with thick slices of honey bread, the steam rising in fragrant, sweet plumes. The interruption was visceral. The precise frequency Siddharth had cultivated snapped, and the golden glow in the blanket flickered violently, dimming to a pale, sickly yellow. The sudden loss of resonance felt like a physical blow to his chest, a sharp vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs. He gasped, his fingers twitching against the wool as the warmth began to leach out of the fibers and back into the cold air of the room. Siddharth didn't look up immediately. He remained knelt, his forehead nearly touching the fabric, fighting the sudden surge of vertigo that threatened to pull him sideways. He had to restart the hum, but the momentum was gone. He swallowed hard, tasting metal tang, and forced a new sound from his throat. This time, he had to push harder. He reached deeper into his own reserves, pulling energy from the marrow of his bones to compensate for the flicker. The effort was grueling. It felt as though he were trying to push a heavy stone up a steep incline. He gritted his teeth, the sibilance of his breath turning into a strained hiss as he forced the amber light to return, brighter and more insistent than before, to overwrite the instability Dahlia's entrance had caused. As the glow stabilized, a heavy, leaden sensation settled into his legs. The double expenditure of energy had drained him of his remaining strength, leaving his muscles feeling dense and unresponsive, as if his veins had been filled with wet cement. He shifted his weight, but his knees felt unstable, trembling slightly under the weight of his own body. He had traded his physical equilibrium for the warmth of the wool, a bargain he accepted without hesitation. The sanctuary demanded a price, and Siddharth Varma had always been a willing payer. He smoothed a crease in the blanket with a lingering touch, his movement slow and deliberate, masking the tremor in his hand. Dahlia, oblivious to the internal collapse he was managing, set the honey bread on a side table with a rhythmic tap of her fingers against the wood. She leaned over the blanket, her eyes glazing over with a distant, dreamy look. "The sheep that gave us this wool, oh, they were the most peculiar creatures," she began, her voice drifting into a soft, airy register. "They spent all autumn gathered around the old willow by the creek, watching the leaves turn. I remember one particular a stubborn thing with a notch in her left ear, who seemed convinced she could speak to the wind. She would stand perfectly still for hours, her fleece catching the light just like this." As she spoke, Dahlia began to wander, her steps guided more by the memory of the willow tree than by the layout of the room. She drifted toward the mantel, her gaze fixed on some internal horizon, her shoulder inches away from a tall, flickering beeswax candle. The flame danced precariously, the heat radiating against her skin, but she was far gone in her daydream. Siddharth watched her, his heart skipping a beat. He couldn't afford to move quickly, his legs were still protesting, but he couldn't let her ignite her apron. With a slow, fluid motion, he reached out and caught her wrist, gently redirecting her path away from the fire. His touch was light, a mere suggestion of movement, but it was enough to bring her back to the present. "The honey bread smells wonderful, Dahlia," he murmured, his voice regaining its melodic, rhythmic quality. He let go of her wrist, tilting his head as he listened to the room. That was when he noticed it. The golden hum had not ceased when he stopped his own vocalization. It was still there, a low, independent vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It wasn't just in the blankets anymore, the luminescence had saturated the air. The sound was a physical presence, a resonance that echoed off the cedar beams and vibrated in the floorboards. It felt as though the house had become a giant tuning fork, struck by a hand that refused to let go. The air thickened, becoming a tactile weight that pushed against the skin, a warm golden pressure that made every movement feel as if it were happening underwater. The sanctuary had reached critical saturation. The peace was no longer a feeling, but a physical density. Siddharth stood up, his movement sluggish and heavy. He felt the weight of the room pressing against him, a comforting but overwhelming force. He studied the blankets, now glowing with a steady, unwavering amber light that illuminated the room without the need for candles. The space was perfect. It was a fortress of warmth, a frictionless void where the concept of cold was an impossibility. He felt a flicker of pride, though it was tempered by the profound exhaustion that made his vision swim. He had created a masterpiece of comfort, a place where any weary soul could collapse and be instantly healed of their burdens. He turned toward the heavy iron door, intending to prepare himself for the guests. The house was humming, the air was gold, and the honey bread was fragrant. Everything was in its place. But as he approached the threshold, he stopped. The silence between the vibrations was broken by a metal-sharp click. He watched, frozen, as the heavy iron handle began to turn. It wasn't the frantic rattle of someone escaping the storm or the hesitant touch of a stranger. It was a slow, deliberate pressure, a steady, mechanical rotation that spoke of an unwavering certainty. The handle turned fully, and the door began to creak open, admitting a sliver of the freezing night and a presence that felt like a void in the middle of the gold. Siddharth braced himself, smoothing his tunic one last time, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that barely carried over the hum of the room. "You've arrived exactly when you were meant to," he said, though he knew the man on the other side didn't believe in such things. Clitty sink. "And the zoning permits for the East Wing are still pending, not to mention the transit overlap on the 4th Street corridor," Chioma Adiemi said to no one. She burst through the heavy iron door, her voice a clipped staccato that sliced through the room's golden saturation. She didn't enter the sanctuary so much as collide with it, her boots clicking sharply against the floorboards, her mind still racing at the speed of a metropolitan subway. She carried a mental ledger of architectural deadlines and municipal red tape like a heavy, invisible cloak. She stopped mid-sentence. The air hit her as a texture, a thick, fragrant wall of cedar and warm honey. For a moment, Chioma froze, her lungs expanding against a pressure that felt like a physical embrace. The contrast was a sensory shock. Her internal map was still adjusted to wet asphalt and the sharp tang of industrial air conditioners. Here, the air was golden, humming with a low-frequency vibration that resonated in the marrow of her bones. She blinked, her pupils contracting against an amber light that seemed a property of the space itself. Habit took over. Chioma didn't relax, she analyzed. Her eyes, trained for blueprints and load-bearing walls, scanned the room for efficiency. She noted the placement of the cedar beams and the structural flow of the furniture, searching for friction, the bottlenecks where movement would be hindered or gaps where heat would escape. She saw cushions and blankets as objects of utility, calculating textile density and spatial arrangement. To her, the room was a puzzle of ergonomics to be solved rather than an experience to be felt. She stood rigid, shoulders hiked, fingers twitching as if searching for a stylus to mark a correction on the air. Siddharth Varma watched her from the periphery. He didn't greet her with words. Instead, he tilted his head, listening to the discordant rhythm of her breathing. He felt her anxiety clashing with the saturation of the sanctuary, creating a jagged edge in the room's peace. Gently, Siddharth shifted his internal resonance. He let out a low, melodic hum that started deep in his chest and rolled outward, turning the golden hum into a grounding thrum, a sonic anchor designed to target the knot of stress in her shoulders. Chioma felt the sound as a gravitational shift. Her gaze drifted toward a luminescent cushion, a plush, amber-hued heap of wool and light. Sitting was a cessation of progress, and progress was the only currency she had ever known, but the cushion called to her. She moved toward it with a suspicious step, as if the furniture were a trap. The moment her weight touched the fabric, she felt a visceral sink. It was as if the cushion were an active participant in her descent, drawing the rigidity from her vertebrae like a magnet pulling iron filings from sand. She gasped, a small, startled noise in the humming silence. The intensity of the release felt like a loss of control, and it terrified her. Her hand flew to her coat pocket, scrambling for the cold glass of her phone. She needed a notification or a deadline to anchor herself back into the world of deliverables. But as she tried to lift her arm, she found the limb impossibly heavy. The atmosphere had become a golden syrup that slowed her movements to a crawl. Lifting her hand felt like hoisting a granite slab. The phone remained in her pocket, a useless piece of circuitry in a room that demanded a different kind of connectivity. Then, the internal noise began to fade. The overlapping voices of contractors and the phantom ring of emails were replaced by a ringing silence that felt physically oppressive, a void where her identity as a doers usually resided. A flicker of panic rose, the sensation of disappearing into the warmth. But as the silence deepened, the panic evolved into a heavy surrender. The blueprints in her mind blurred into watercolor washes of amber and cedar. She was no longer an architect analyzing a space, she was a body occupying a moment. Chioma let out a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade of sleepless nights. Her head fell back, her muscles collapsing in a surrender she hadn't known she needed. Her eyelids grew heavy, the golden light filtering through her lashes like honey. Her heart rate slowed, syncing with the rhythmic thrum of the house. For the first time in years, the checklist went blank. There was no next task, no pending permit. There was only the warmth of the wool, the scent of honey bread, and the feeling of being utterly held by a room that asked nothing of her. Siddharth remained a soft shadow in the amber light. He watched the tension leave her face, her features smoothing into a mask of genuine peace. He had seen many travelers arrive with the city still screaming in their ears, but Chioma's silence was a hard-won victory. He stepped back, allowing her the sanctuary of her own exhaustion. The room continued to vibrate, ensuring the cold of the winter night remained a distant, irrelevant memory. Peace was absolute, a frictionless void where time had ceased to be a linear progression of deadlines and had become a circular pool of stillness. Just as Chioma drifted on the precipice of sleep, the silence was punctured. It wasn't the melodic hum of the house, but a sharp, metal-sharp click, precise, cold, and devoid of warmth. It was the sound of a precision timepiece being wound with obsessive intensity, a mechanical needle pricking the skin of the golden atmosphere. Chioma's eyes snapped open. The piece was fractured, replaced by a sharp awareness of a presence that did not belong in the flow of the room. From the shadows near the iron door, a man stepped forward. He wore a charcoal coat that absorbed the amber light, and in his hand he held a silver pocket watch. He didn't look at Chioma with kindness. He studied her as if she were a variable in an equation solved incorrectly. He clicked the watch shut with a finality that echoed through the cedar beams, the sound cutting through the golden hum like a guillotine. He glanced at the walls, then at Siddharth, his expression one of clinical disapproval. 3 minutes and 14 seconds behind schedule, the man said, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth. The spiraling steam. Hassan al-Rashid did not simply place the saucers, he adjusted them. Standing by the cedar table with a small brass ruler, he measured the distance between the porcelain edge and the table's rim with the intensity of a cartographer. Each saucer had to be perfectly parallel, a precise alignment mirroring the internal architecture of his own mind. To Hassan, order was the only reliable bulkhead against a world that refused to stay still. He nudged a saucer a fraction of a millimeter to the left. "Precision is the precursor to peace," Hassan said, his voice crisp, cutting through the amber haze of the room. He didn't look up. "If the foundation is skewed, the experience is compromised. The infusion, for instance, must steep for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. At 4 minutes and 13 seconds, the tannins override the floral notes, and the equilibrium is lost." Chioma, wrapped in the wool blanket Siddharth had imbued with warmth, watched him from the sofa. Hassan's mechanical rigor had pulled her from the precipice of sleep, but the shock was dampened by the lingering glow of the room. She wanted to tell him the tea would taste the same whether it steeped for 4 minutes or 5, but the effort felt like lifting a stone. She simply leaned back into the cushions with a long, contented sigh. Siddharth moved through the space like a slow current, his footsteps silent on the wide floorboards. He watched Hassan's rigidity, the locked shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the ruler, and felt a flicker of empathy. Hassan lived in a world of lines and limits, where the clock was master and the heart a secondary instrument. Siddharth believed in the flow, the intuitive drift of a moment that didn't need to be measured to be felt. Siddharth reached for a plate of honey cakes, their edges caramelized to gold and smelling of toasted cloves. As he placed the plate on the table, he did not align it with the saucers. He set it slightly off-center, tilted at a jaunty angle that disrupted the linear sequence. It was a tiny act of rebellion, a geometric discord introduced into a symphony of symmetry. Siddharth stepped back, his eyes soft as he waited. Hassan froze. His gaze locked onto the misplaced plate, and for several seconds he didn't breathe. The sight was a physical blow, a smudge on a clean canvas. A visible tremor started in his left hand. The friction between his need for order and the languid flow of the room created a tension that vibrated in the air. To Hassan, the off-center plate was an invitation to instability. He inhaled, preparing to correct the placement with a sharp movement. But as he leaned forward, his line of sight shifted to the tea steeping in the glass pot. From the spout, a thin ribbon of steam was escaping. He stopped. The steam wasn't rising in a straight line. It was curling in a lazy, hypnotic spiral, a slow-motion dance that defied any single vector. Hassan tried instinctively to calculate the velocity of the vapor, to map the curvature against the cedar beams, but the steam shifted and dissolved the moment he tried to pin it down. It was an organic, unpredictable shape that existed only for a second before vanishing. He watched the spiral widen, then tighten, then drift toward the ceiling in a graceful arc. For the first time in years, Hassan stopped counting. The ticking of the silver pocket watch in his pocket seemed to fade, replaced by the low-frequency thrum of the house. He felt a loosening of a knot he hadn't realized he had been tying for a lifetime. The steam didn't care about 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It simply existed, moving without a destination, flowing without a deadline. Hassan's hand reached toward the crooked saucer, his fingers twitching with the habitual urge to align it. He hovered millimeters from the porcelain. He studied the saucer, then the spiraling steam, and then Siddharth, who watched him with infinite patience. In a conscious act of will, Hassan pulled his hand back. He let his arm drop to his side. He chose to leave the saucer crooked. He chose to let the plate remain off-center. It was a surrender of the ruler to the rhythm of the room. "The blur," Chioma murmured, her voice a breathy echo. "There is such a beauty in the blur." Her eyes were half closed, her presence in the room as fluid as the steam in the pot. She was simply drifting on the tide of the amber light. Hassan didn't respond. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to check the time, a reflex born of 1,000 deadlines. He reached into the charcoal pocket of his coat and flicked open the silver pocket watch, intending to verify exactly how many seconds had been lost to his distraction. But the glass space of the watch had fogged over. The warmth of the room and the humidity of the tea had condensed into a fine, opaque mist across the crystal. The hands of the watch, the needles that governed his life, were gone, hidden behind a veil of white vapor. He tried to wipe the glass with his thumb, but the fog returned instantly, as if the room itself were refusing to let him return to the world of seconds and minutes. Hassan looked at the blurred face of his watch and then at the room. He didn't feel the panic he expected. Instead, he felt a lightness, as if a heavy coat had been lifted from his shoulders. He closed the watch with a soft click and placed it face down on the table, right next to the tilted plate of cakes. He didn't align it with the edge, he just let it lie there, an instrument of precision rendered useless by a moment of grace. Siddharth let out a low, melodic hum that vibrated through the floorboards. He stepped forward and poured the tea, the liquid flowing in a golden stream that mirrored the curves of the steam. As the scent of chamomile and wild honey filled the air, Hassan realized that for the first time in his professional life, he didn't know exactly what time it was, and for the first time, he found that he didn't mind at all. The quiet pause. "Close your eyes," Gwan-ho whispered, his voice a dry rustle of pine needles against a winter window. "Do not seek the silence. Let the silence find you, and when it arrives, breathe with the flame." They sat in a semicircle on the wide, honey-colored floorboards, the air thick with the scent of chamomile and the heavy, sweet musk of beeswax. Beside them, a dozen candles flickered in a slow, synchronized dance, their light pulsing like a collective heartbeat. Gwan-ho sat at the center, his back a straight line of weathered cedar, his eyes closed in a way that suggested he was seeing something far more vivid than the room around them. He didn't move a muscle, yet his presence seemed to expand, filling the gaps between the furniture and the rafters. Chioma felt the tension in her shoulders, the ghost of 1,000 blueprints and deadlines, begin to fray. She followed the instruction, closing her eyes, and suddenly the world became a symphony of soft sounds. There was the rhythmic tick of a clock that had long since stopped, the distant sigh of the wind in the eaves, and then the breathing. It started as 5 disjointed rhythms, a cacophony of shallow gasps and hesitant sighs. But as Gwan-ho's presence anchored them, the breaths began to merge. In, out. A slow tidal swell that pulled them all into a single shared pulse. The room didn't just feel warm, it felt alive, as if the house itself were breathing with them. "Imagine the lake of mirrors," Dahlia began, her voice a sing-song cadence that drifted through the amber light like a ribbon of silk. She didn't speak to them so much as she wove her words into the spaces between their breaths. A place where the water is so still, it doesn't just reflect the sky, it becomes the sky. If you were to reach down and touch the surface, you wouldn't feel cold water, but the velvet touch of a cloud. You are walking along the shore now, the sand warm beneath your feet, every grain a tiny golden spark of memory. As Dahlia spoke, the boundaries of the room seemed to dissolve. Chioma felt the luminescent blanket draped over her shoulders shift from a piece of fabric to a liquid embrace. The warmth was no longer external, it was seeping into her marrow, dissolving the rigid architecture of her identity. She thought of the city, the screech of the subway, the blue light of the monitor at 3:30 a.m., the constant gnawing fear that she was 3 minutes behind a schedule that didn't exist. It all felt like a story told about someone else, a frantic, noisy dream from which she had finally woken. Is this what it means to disappear? She wondered, the thought surfacing like a bubble in a still pond. To let the edges of myself blur until there is no me left to plan, to organize, to fail. It's terrifying. I am losing the only version of myself I know how to be. If I let go of the stress, what is left? Just a hollow space where a career used to be. Am I becoming a ghost in my own skin? Or is this the first time I've actually inhabited it? She felt a sudden, sharp spike of vertigo, a momentary panic that the silence was too heavy, a weight that might crush the breath right out of her lungs. The stillness became a vacuum, pulling at her consciousness. But then she gripped the edge of the wool blanket. The fabric was coarse yet comforting, the luminescence humming against her palms with a steady, golden vibration. That tactile anchor snapped her back. The fear didn't vanish, it simply changed shape, softening into a deep, heavy peace that felt like sinking into a warm bath after a lifetime of walking through snow. Beside her, Hassan's breathing had slowed to a precarious crawl. He was no longer adjusting his glasses or aligning the edges of his sleeves. His chin had dropped toward his chest, his frame sagging. Gwan-ho's eyelids flickered open just a fraction, his gaze sweeping over the group with a clinical yet tender precision. He sensed the slide. They were drifting too far, sliding toward a dreamless sleep before the mental release had been fully processed. If they fell asleep now, They would wake with the tension still locked in their joints, merely exhausted rather than liberated. "Stay," Gwan-ho whispered, the word a gentle command that vibrated in the air. "Not sleep, but wakeful sleep. Be the bridge between the dream and the stone. Feel the weight of your limbs, but let the weight be a gift, not a burden." He introduced a subtle shift in the rhythm, a slight acceleration of the breath that acted like a tether, pulling them back from the edge of oblivion. It was a delicate balance, keeping the body limp and surrendered while keeping the mind a shimmering, observant flame. Chioma felt the shift as a ripple of electricity through her spine. She wasn't awake in the way she used to be, but she wasn't gone. She was suspended in a state of pure presence, where the only thing that mattered was the scent of honey and the sound of 5 hearts beating in a slow, staggered harmony. In that moment, the sense of individuality vanished entirely. Chioma no longer felt where her skin ended and the blanket began, or where the blanket ended and the floor started. They were a single organism, a collective of relaxation breathing in the golden glow. There was no architect, no archivist, no artisan, only a shared humming silence that tasted of chamomile and ancient peace. It was a radical intimacy, a stripping away of all social armor, until they were nothing but breath and warmth. Siddharth, who had been the silent conductor of the room's energy, felt a sudden instinctive urge to check the hearth. He knew the embers of the fire were leaning toward ash, and a sudden draft might chill the delicate equilibrium they had achieved. He attempted to shift his weight, intending to rise and tend to the flames. But he found he could not move. It wasn't a paralysis of fear or a sudden illness. It was as if the very atmosphere he had spent the evening crafting, the saturation of peace, the density of the luminescence, had become a physical weight. The room had become so thick with tranquility that it acted like a warm, golden syrup, pinning him to his seat. He tried to lift his arm, but the movement felt slow and luxurious, as if he were moving through deep water. He realized with a start that he had overshot the mark. He had created a sanctuary so perfect, so frictionless, that it had captured its creator in its own web of serenity. He let out a soft, breathy laugh that didn't disturb the silence. He was a prisoner of his own kindness, held captive by the very peace he had sought to give others. He leaned back, surrendering to the heaviness, and closed his eyes. As the fire popped softly in the grate, casting a final, brilliant spark across the floor, the group remained locked in their golden stasis, unable and unwilling to return to the world of clocks and calendars. The velvet darkness. The amber light had ceased to be a visual thing. It had become a weight, a heavy, honeyed press that pinned Siddharth to the velvet cushions of his chair. He felt his consciousness fraying, thinning out into a single, shimmering thread that vibrated with the collective rhythm of the room. For hours, he had been the architect of this stillness, the one weaving the luminescence into the wool and the air, but the balance had shifted. He was no longer the conductor of the symphony. He had become a note within it, a soft, low frequency that was being slowly absorbed by the surrounding peace. The exhaustion he had pushed aside to ensure the blankets were warm and the infusions were steaming now arrived not as a crash, but as a slow, luxurious tide, pulling him under with a gentle, insistent gravity. He tried to blink, but his eyelids felt as though they were lined with silk, heavy and reluctant. Beside him, Chioma's breathing had slowed to a deep, oceanic cadence. Her previous rigidity dissolved entirely. She looked less like a woman and more like a sculpture of surrender, her head tilted back, her features smoothed of every urban anxiety. Siddharth watched her, feeling a strange, detached pride. He had given her a sanctuary where the clocks stopped ticking, and in doing so, he had accidentally built a cage of comfort that he could not, or would not, escape. The air tasted of dried orange peel and old books, a scent that seemed to thicken with every passing second, wrapping around him like a physical shroud of warmth. There was a soft, rhythmic friction of wool against wool. Siddharth felt a presence move beside him, a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, like the growth of a lichen on a stone. A hand, warm and smelling faintly of cinnamon and raw fleece, reached out. Dahlia did not speak. The silence of the room was too sacred for words, a fragile glass sphere that any sudden sound might shatter. With a tenderness that mirrored Siddharth's own devotion to the space, she took the edge of the heavy wool blanket, the one he had spent the evening imbuing with golden light, and tucked it firmly around his shoulders. The weight of it was a revelation. He had provided the warmth for everyone else, forgetting that the provider also requires a place to lean. As the blanket settled, Siddharth felt a sudden, sharp awareness of his own vulnerability. He had spent his life as the scholar, the guide, the one who held the light for others to see by. To be the one cared for, to have the blanket adjusted by a hand that asked for nothing in return, brought a lump to his throat that felt like a physical obstruction. He didn't move, didn't thank her. He simply let his head sink deeper into the cushion, his breath hitching once before, aligning itself with the staggered harmony of the others. He was no longer the master of the sanctuary. He was a guest in a house of his own making, finally allowed to be tired. Across the room, Gwan-ho sat in a state of absolute stillness, his eyes closed, his presence a grounding anchor that prevented the golden stasis from drifting into a dream. Beside him, Hassan had finally ceased his constant adjustments. The archivist's glasses had slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose, and his hands, usually so preoccupied with the alignment of objects, lay open and empty on his lap. The five of them were locked in a shared restorative slumber, a biological synchronization where the boundaries of the self blurred. Siddharth could feel the ghost of Hassan's precision and the echo of Chioma's relief blending into a single, humming vibration that resonated in the marrow of his bones. Yet, a flicker of duty remained. He looked toward the hearth where the fire had dwindled to a heap of pulsing red embers, and then to the candles scattered across the side tables. The flames were low, guttering in the stillness, casting long, dancing shadows that licked the walls. He knew that if he let the light vanish naturally, the transition to darkness might be too abrupt, a sudden drop that could startle the sleepers from their deep descent. To truly finish the work, the light had to be extinguished with intention. It had to be a conscious closing of the door. Siddharth attempted to move. It was a monumental effort, a struggle against a medium that felt like thick, warm syrup. He shifted his shoulder, and the movement felt as though he were swimming through a lake of gold. Every inch of progress required a conscious command of will, a slow-motion battle against the luxury of his own paralysis. He slid from the chair, his feet meeting the rug with a muffled thud that felt like a distant explosion in the profound silence. He stood for a moment swaying, his balance precarious, feeling the gravity of the room pulling at his limbs, urging him to simply lie down and vanish into the velvet. He reached for the silver candle snuffer on the mahogany table. His fingers felt clumsy, thick, as if he were wearing gloves of lead. He gripped the handle and moved toward the first candle. The flame was a tiny, trembling spear of gold. With a soft, deliberate click, he extinguished it. The light shrank, and a small plume of gray smoke curled upward, smelling of beeswax and old memories. The darkness didn't feel like a void. It felt like a blanket being drawn over the room, layer by layer. He moved to the second candle, then the third, his movements rhythmic and slow, a funeral procession for the evening's light. With each click of the snuffer, the golden amber of the room deepened into a bruised purple, then a rich oceanic blue. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the floor to touch the sleeping forms of his companions. He felt a strange sense of shedding. With every flame he killed, he was shedding a piece of his responsibility, a layer of his identity as the provider. He was becoming a shadow among shadows, a ghost in his own sanctuary. When he reached the final candle, positioned near the dying hearth, he paused. The room was now a velvet darkness, a protective cocoon that muffled the world outside the walls of Sjölycka. The only sound was the synchronized breathing of the four others, a slow, deep, collective lung that seemed to be breathing for the house itself. Siddharth looked at the tiny, flickering wick, the last remnant of the golden stasis. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of peace, a realization that the work was complete. There was nothing left to arrange, nothing left to imbue, nothing left to fix. He lowered the snuffer. The final flame vanished with a soft, definitive hiss. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, warm weight that pressed against his skin with a comforting familiarity. Siddharth didn't try to find his way back to the chair. He simply let his knees buckle, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his back against the cool plaster. He let go of the last thread of consciousness, the final tether that kept him anchored to the waking world. He fell into the void of sleep, not as a descent, but as a homecoming, his mind dissolving into the rhythmic pulse of the house. For a long time, there was only the silence. The kind of silence that exists only in the deepest parts of a forest or the bottom of a still lake. The five souls lay in the dark, their heartbeats echoing one another in a slow, staggered dance. The sanctuary had achieved its final state. It was no longer a place of restoration, but a place of total, shared oblivion. The world of clocks, calendars, and schedules had ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the wool, the scent of honey, and the velvet embrace of the night. Just as the last vestiges of thought vanished from Siddharth's mind, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. It was a sharp, clinical sound, a disruption of the rhythmic peace. The door, which had been closed with such deliberate certainty earlier, groaned on its hinges, opening just a few inches. A sliver of moonlight cut through the velvet darkness, a cold silver blade that sliced across the floor and landed tebatly on the sleeping forms. A voice, crisp and devoid of the room's warmth, drifted through the gap, sounding like a clock ticking in an empty room. The window for restorative slumber has expired. We are precisely 4 minutes behind the projected recovery curve.